So Linda, welcome to the Feel Better, Live More podcast.
Thank you. So
you've written this amazing book called Chasing the Sun, which I first came across a few months ago, and we've been trying to schedule this for a little bit of time now. I've got to say it's a brilliant book. It's such a fun read. There is so much research in there, so many anecdotes. I think you've really touched on something that doesn't get talked about enough in the context of health, and that is sunlight. May I ask, how did you start to get interested in the science and the relationship between sunlight and our health?
I think the way I first became interested in it was through research on circadian rhythms. So these are 24-hour fluctuations in our biology. So everything from our brain chemistry to when we feel sleepy and alert, which is what most people think about when you talk about circadian rhythms, to the functioning of our immune systems, to when we release hormones. And you have these rhythms in your biology to help you prepare for regular events like getting up and being out and active in the daytime and being indoors and protected and sleeping at night. And probably about sort of 10, 15 years ago, I was working at New Scientist as a news editor, and I was coming across a lot of stories about circadian rhythms. I think the International Agency for Cancer Research, I don't know if I've got that name right, but had recently declared shift work a probable human carcinogen, which suggests that shift work contributes to cancer, or there's certainly an association between working night shifts and later development of cancer. And I'd also just written this story about how breast milk varies over the course of 24 hours. So it contains more kind of sleep-inducing chemicals at night compared to in the morning. So I was really interested in this kind of emerging field of circadian rhythms. And around that time, I took a trip to Las Vegas in the US to cover a conference on a completely different subject. But, Las Vegas is a long way away, and I had terrible jet lag, and I was in this meeting with these forensic scientists actually in a kind of windowless meeting room in this business hotel for about 3 days, working from like 9 till 5. And then in the evenings, we were kind of going around the casinos and enjoying what Las Vegas has to offer. And by the end, and with my jet lag as well, by the end of this, I was just desperate to get outside and just, get a little bit of that glorious desert sunlight. And I just couldn't, because the whole city, despite being in the desert, and this was in October, so there was like this beautiful blue sky, it wasn't too hot. Despite this, being in this amazing location, it's impossible to get outside. The whole city is kind of set up to shield you from the sun. And probably that a lot of that's deliberate because, the casino owners want people to stay in their casinos and lose track of time. And daylight is a really good way we use to keep track of time. But they also deploy light in all sorts of cunning ways. So they do, there have been studies suggesting that if you pair red light, especially with fast-paced music, people take riskier gambles and bet more money. Anyway, by the end of this, I was just like, I just need to get outside. I need to find somewhere to sit. And I just couldn't find anywhere until I was like walking through this labyrinthine kind of underground shopping complex at Caesar's Palace Casino. And I saw what I thought was sunlight up ahead. And then when I got there, I looked up and I realized I was standing like under this completely artificial sky.
Yeah.
And I just went, my God, our relationship with sunlight has been completely distorted and changed in this modern world. Las Vegas is kind of an extreme example, but
it is extreme, but there's a real irony there on one level that, to us as humans, we've always evolved. In many ways, the sun's been our focal point, right? We've had to revolve our life around the sun. When the sun comes up, we can wake up and do the things that we want to do in the daytime. And then as it falls and it sets, we start to slow down and we can unwind and go to sleep. Yeah, you're right, Las Vegas is an extreme. In fact, on one level, it's almost completely flipped it on its head.
Yeah.
It's almost, in many ways, living in Las Vegas or being in Las Vegas is putting your body into an environment that humans have never been in for our entire evolutionary history, right?
No, and at night, the Las Vegas Strip is reportedly the brightest place on Earth. So it really is,
So man has in many ways conquered nature in Las Vegas, or so it would seem, right? Because ultimately, I think what's really beautifully illustrated in your book is how this is not as trivial as it might sound when we're joking about it. There are some really quite serious implications for our health, aren't there?
Yeah, our biology is kind of set up to work with this 24-hour cycle of light and darkness. And if you mess with that, things start to happen to, first of all, to these circadian rhythms, so these 24-hour fluctuations in our biology. So if you're exposed to light at night, one thing that does is it pushes your circadian rhythms later. That's not necessarily a bad thing unless you have to wake up to go to work or school the next morning. And if you're kind of seeing light late at night and your circadian rhythms are being pushed later, that means the time when you feel sleepy and want to go to sleep is pushed later. So you potentially get less sleep. And if you get less sleep, that's going to have an impact on your alertness, on your mental functioning, on your mood. But it's more than that, because bright light is also a kind of brain stimulant. It boosts your alertness. So if you see light late at night, you're going to feel more awake. But also, if you don't see light in the daytime, you're going to feel more sluggish and less alert. And there are increasingly studies showing that bright light it literally wakes us up. So, we now spend 90% of our daytimes indoors, where the light levels are like an order of magnitude lower than they are outdoors. Today is kind of grey and rainy and gloomy. Luminance or brightness is measured in this unit called lux. And on a day like today, it's about 5,000 lux outside. On a bright, sunny day in the middle of summer, it could be as high as 100,000 lux outside. But indoors, in the kind of standard office, it might be 200 to 300 lux. So it's hugely dimmer inside than it is outside.
So even on a cloudy day,
we
have evolved to actually have at least 5,000-10,000 lux of light exposure to our, through our eyes into our body. Yet, for many of us living these 90% indoor lifestyles now, we might be getting only 200-300 lux. So what is the implication of that? What does that mean for us?
Well, okay, so light can influence the timing of those circadian rhythms. It can also influence the amplitude of those rhythms. So how kind of high the peaks are and low the troughs are. So what you see in people who don't get outside much, and particularly this has been studied in hospital patients and people as they age, so elderly patients in care homes, their circadian rhythms kind of flatten. So there's less difference between nighttime and daytime in their biology. And that is linked to poorer health. So things like depression, increased risk of dementia, that sort of thing.
It's incredible to think about this because, I think about, from what you just said, I think about my mother, and mum lives by herself now, and she's become a lot more immobile. So she'll spend a lot of time inside most of the day. And, she also loves this iPad that I got her a few years ago. And so not only is she not exposing herself to this bright natural light in the day, often in the evening, she's exposing herself to bright artificial light, which again, in many ways is sort of doing the Las Vegas thing on herself, right? It's almost flipping what we should be doing. And the thing I've spent a lot of time thinking about over the last few years, and it was really magnified when I was reading your book, is when we talk about health, the popular media narrative around health always revolves around food and movement. And I've been quite keen to sort of expand that out to include sleep and stress as well. But I think there's a really strong case that actually light and our light exposure is another core pillar of health that maybe we have not been thinking enough about.
Yes, I think it is. And our light exposure also plays into those things, especially the kind of movement side of things and stress, actually, because, in my book, I kind of strongly advocate for very small changes to your life, but basically it involves kind of brightening your daytime and darkening your evenings and night times. But one brilliant way to brighten your daytime is just to get outside. Do a little bit of exercise, get up from your desk. If you start cycling to work or walking to work, even getting off the bus or train a stop earlier and just doing that last 10 minutes walking, you're getting exercise. You're also out in nature, hopefully, and that's a kind of stress buster. And, there's increasing evidence that spending all day just sitting down, just not getting up and down, again, is really harmful to our health. And again, if you're just making little efforts to just get up, just go for a walk around the block at lunchtime or, on your breaks, space. I think that can make a difference. It will certainly make a difference to your alertness during the daytime, but you're also strengthening those circadian rhythms, which are so important for our health.
Absolutely. I mean, you say you would imagine, but I use this as one of the tips I give my patients in practice. And it's something I wrote about in my first book. And there was a chapter called Embrace Morning Light. And it was in the sleep section. And the whole point was to say, when we talk about sleep, we're often thinking about what we do in the hour and a half before bed. And of course, that can be incredibly important. But we forget about what we do in the morning. And I remember when I've heard this from patients, but I also got quite a few messages on Twitter from people after they read Embrace Morning Light in the 4-pillar plan. They said, I've not been sleeping for years very well, and I now go for a 20-minute walk outside in the morning, and my sleep's got better. So although there are other things that could be playing a role, it really is that powerful. Getting outside in the morning is really, really powerful, isn't it, for setting that circadian rhythm? And I think you had some, let me see if I've got it here in your book. I've actually scribbled all over your book. I hope you don't mind. It's because there's so many great things to talk about.
That's fine. I do lots of book scribbling.
And you talked about this German study that suggested that exposure to bright light in the morning boosted people's reaction speeds and maintained them at a higher level throughout the day, even after that bright light was switched off.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned another study when exposure to bright morning lights, basically those who were exposed to it between 8 a.m. and noon, it took them an average of 18 minutes to fall asleep at night compared to 45 minutes in the low light exposure group. So this is not just, hey, a bit of light in the day. This is actually changing our biology.
There's actually another study that I cite in the book. It's a lab-based study, and it showed that if you expose people to bright light during the daytime, they sleep better the following night. They get more deep sleep and they get less fragmented sleep. And if they do wake up in the night, they feel less tired the next morning, even though they've been waking up at night. So I think it improves the quality of your sleep. But then there's the mood side of things as well. We know that larks, so people who tend to be early birds, wake up early, want to go to sleep earlier at night, tend to be less prone to depression and mental illness. And actually there's lots of other advantages, health advantages to being a lark. But possibly some of this is because if you're exposed to bright morning light, it pulls your circadian rhythms earlier. So even if you're a night owl, if you see lots of bright early morning light, your circadian rhythms are shifted earlier. And I think why that's important for mood is that mood has a 24-hour rhythm, like sleep and like all these other things. And your lowest point of mood tends to be around 4 a.m., 4:30, 5 a.m., before you wake up usually. And then you're kind of going up this slope and getting happier and happier during the daytime. If you shift your circadian rhythms earlier and then you wake up at, say, 6 a.m., 7 a.m., you're already quite a long way up that slope towards a happier mood. But if you're kind of shifted later, if you're kind of like a night owl, or you're making yourself a night owl by your light exposure, when you wake up, you're going to be closer towards that trough of low mood.
It's interesting, isn't it? And I think let's explore chronotypes, because I think that's super fascinating for people, this idea of morning larks and night owls. As you were describing that, I sort of wondered to myself, is it that night owls are more prone to low mood because of their biology, or is it because modern society is set up in a way that that basically is preferential to be a lark, right? I am a lark. I'm an early bird. I like getting up early. I'm a total morning person. So, I can get up and sort of, get hold of the day. And by lunchtime, I've done loads and loads of work and I feel great. Whereas I've got friends and family who don't really operate like that. And, do you feel that if you don't have that chronotype, you are at a disadvantage in the way the world is set up?
Yes, I absolutely do. And teenagers are a really classic example of that, because teenagers naturally shift their circadian rhythms later. They can't help it. This is just something that happens at adolescence. So asking a teenager to get up at 7 a.m. to get ready for school is like asking you or I to get up at 5 a.m. And there's no reason, it's no surprise they feel kind of groggy and cross when they get up in the morning.
It's funny you say that, actually, because it's what we're recording this at the start of September, so schools have just gone back, and my nephew actually has just moved to secondary school. And after I dropped the kids off at school this morning, I saw him at his new bus stop, because he's got to get like a 30-minute bus to his secondary school, and he was half asleep and he was yawning. Now, he's only 11 or 12 years old, so he's not quite a teenager, but I thought, if this was to continue for a few years, I mean, is that the best way to start off a teenager in their school day? You know, I mean, are schools adapting to this research? Are they evolving to this?
Very slowly. So in the UK, we're relatively lucky, actually, on international terms, or our teenagers are relatively lucky, because in the US, on the continent, schools typically start a lot earlier. You know, some schools in the US, at least they used to, start at sort of 8 a.m., 7:30 a.m., some of them. And there have been a number of studies now in the US looking at what happens if you shift the school starting time a bit later, more like 8:30 or 9 a.m., which is what happens in the UK. And it has a really big impact on their absenteeism and on their grades as well, actually. There's been less research on this in the UK because schools here start more like 8:30 or 9 a.m. But certainly there are some schools that are starting to take this seriously. There's a private school in London which is allowing its sixth formers to start at, I think, 1 p.m. or 2 p.m. and do all their learning in the afternoons and early evenings. But there was a study of a secondary school in the UK which changed its start time to 10 a.m. And again, you saw this drop in absenteeism. So kids were less likely to be kind of coming in or not going to school because they were sick. But also their GCSE grades increased following this change. They've now changed back. I'm not sure why they changed back, but they changed back and then they saw a dip again.
It's fascinating that, because on one level, society would probably deem late starters a bit lazy, a bit...
yes, and actually, but there has been a study that has shown that if you have an early bird manager and you're a night owl, they will judge your performance as worse than if you have a fellow employee who is an early bird. Because what that manager is seeing, that manager kind of comes to work like you, all cheerful and like, oh, I'm raring to go at like 9 a.m. And then they're kind of night owl employees come in and they kind of sit there and they need several coffees to wake up. Maybe they don't get going until the early afternoon or even the evening. And that early bird manager has gone home and they don't see that night owl like really, really doing their best work in the evenings. And there's another thing, actually, which is this thing called social jet lag. So I think another reason why night owls might have worse health outcomes is because of this thing called social jet lag. And actually, to quote the circadian biologist Till Roneberg, who came up with this phrase, social jet lag, the more of it you have, the fatter, dumber, grumpier, and sicker you'll be. Because what social jet lag is where your sleep and wake times differ between weekdays and weekends. Because if you're a night owl, and you're having to get up early all throughout the week, you're probably cutting short your sleep on those weekdays because you're not kind of naturally disposed to feel sleepy until quite late in the evenings. So you're getting short sleep on weekdays. And then on weekends, you're sleeping in to make up for that. So there's this difference between your kind of sleep and wake times on weekdays and those sleep and wake times on weekends. And you're effectively moving time zones when you do that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, there's so many themes I want to pick up on. I guess on social jet lag, we see this in medicine a lot, that certain things get triggered by lie-ins at the weekend. So it's very well known that migraines are often triggered by lying in at the weekends. And once you start to understand circadian biology, you start to now put together some mechanisms as to why that might happen. So people are always told to get up at the weekend at the same time as on the weekday, as a strategy maybe to prevent a migraine at the weekends, which is super fascinating.
I didn't know that, but certainly psychiatric episodes have been shown to be associated with jet lag. So, doesn't that all support just how strong and robust our circadian biology is, and how messing around with it can have unforeseen implications? Yes, I think it does. We were just talking about how how social jet lag is literally like real jet lag, that you're kind of shifting time zones, twice a week between the weekdays and weekends. Your body clocks will adapt, but actually what's increasingly becoming evident is that we now know we have these clocks in all our tissues. It's not just a kind of single clock in the brain. You've got them everywhere in your heart cells, your liver cells, your fat cells even have these clocks. And they don't all adjust at exactly the same rate. So if you change time zones, either by traveling abroad or by shifting your sleep-wake times, you're dragging all of those clocks along to a new time zone, but they don't all move at the same time. So what you get is this kind of circadian desynchrony spreading throughout the body, where these clocks start to be out of time with each other, and eventually they will all get back in time with each other. But in the meantime, you have this kind of, the way I see the body and these circadian clocks working in the body is a bit like a factory assembly line. To do something simple like digest a meal, it requires coordination between quite a lot of different organs and tissues. You've got your gut cells, you've got your liver, you've got your fat cells, you've got your pancreas that produces insulin. So you need this kind of coordinated talk between these different organs. And just like in a factory production line, if things start getting out of time with each other, you get a less efficient manufacturing process and a less good product. It's the same with our health, I think.
I think people who've traveled over multiple time zones will recognize that even if you start to adjust to the new sleep time, your gut, your digestion, things aren't quite right. So some of it's left behind on your old clock still, or it takes a bit longer. And, you can have this sensation that I've certainly felt sometimes when you eat in your new time zone out of sync with what your body's clock is telling you is the right thing. And the next morning you can actually feel hungover. And you've not drunk any alcohol, but you feel hungover because everything's just slightly out of sync.
Yeah, and I definitely get that. That's one of the worst things I find about jet lag, is that kind of digestive problems. But actually, food is another thing. So light affects the timing of our clock and causes our clocks to change time. But actually, the timing of when we eat also affects the timing of some of those clocks in some of those tissues. So ideally, we want to be kind of syncing our light exposure and our eating patterns with, we want to be basically getting up, eating, and then when it gets dark, stopping eating. I mean, that's the way we evolved. And I think if you're kind of eating later, there's evidence that if you eat later, you're more prone to put on weight, even though you're eating exactly the same meal. I think really what we want is regularity, both in our light exposure, but also in our meal times and our exercise. So there's some evidence now that exercise also affects the timing of those clocks.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very clear light does. Food is known to impact the circadian clock. And I think we're going to find more and more things are. And I think this really, for me, it really highlights why I think humans, so certainly if I talk about myself and my experience with patients, when you have a routine that's roughly, pretty similar from day to day, you just feel better. When your sleep times are regular, when your meal times are regular, even Monday to Friday, and you maintain that at the weekend. I mean, some people may listen and go, well, what sort of life is that? That's people might think that's a boring, dull life. I don't know whether it's my age or not. I love regularity and routine. I love being able to go to bed at the same time, wake up at the same time, eat roughly at the same time. And, Sachin Panda, who you've, I think, quoted a couple of times in your book, he's been on the podcast. He's done incredible research to show that the timing of our meals certainly has huge importance, arguably could be as important as what you eat. I mean, I think the jury is still out on that, but it's pretty powerful that just changing the timing of your meals can impact your weight, your immune system, and your circadian clock.
Yeah. And I think so while I was writing this book, I made quite a few changes to my lifestyle, starting with light, really. And we can talk about my experiment that I did.
I would love to talk about that. It sounds like the sort of wacky experiment that I would do with my kids. Right, kids, Daddy's got a new plan today. Like, what is it this time? So, but we will go into that in just a second.
I'll tell you about that in a minute. But so the first kind of changes I made was to do with my light exposure. But then I got more and more interested in this idea of social jet lag and also the meal timing. And I mean, just in the last year, I've been recording a podcast for the BBC, which involves having to get up one day a week really, really early to go to London. And I just started going, this is, I know from all my research that this is bad for me, but I really, really feel it, because one day a week I'm having to get up at 6 a.m. rather than 7:30 when I normally do. And the next day I feel like I have jet lag. And so now I've realized that if I'm going to keep going to London or having, some days where I have to get up early, it makes sense to always try and get up a bit early.
Yeah.
Once you do that, and once you establish that regularity, you do feel better.
So why don't you've tantalizingly told the listeners and the viewers about this experiment that you did. So first of all, tell me, what was the experiment? And also, I'm really intrigued to know, when you came home one day with this idea and you thought you'd tell your husband, is it? Mm-hmm. And your kids about your new idea, what was the response?
Okay. Well, and this is relevant to this whole thing of, I don't want to go to bed early, and it's really boring if I go to bed early, because, a lot of us are like, well, I feel alert at night and I want to go out at night and see my friends and stuff. But after this experiment, I've kind of changed my view of this. So my idea was, what would happen if we go cold turkey on artificial light after dark? That was my original thing. I was just interested in what happens if we get rid of all this artificial light. And so I went and saw these sleep researchers at the University of Surrey and said, I'd like to do this experiment. Will you help me? And they said, yes. But what we'd like you to always also think about is to try and boost your daylight exposure, which is how I first came across all this research, or emerging research about the importance of daylight. So we devised this experiment and we did it in the middle of winter, where I would turn off the lights in the house after. I wanted to do it when the sun went down, but that was kind of impractical, because I wanted to carry on my work as normal. And I work on a computer, so I couldn't really.
And you're a journalist.
And I'm a journalist, and I'm a freelance journalist. So if I don't work, then I don't get paid. So it was impractical to do that, but that's kind of okay anyway, because if we evolved closer to the equator with a more kind of like 12-hour light dark exposure thing, we reasoned that wasn't such a terrible thing to do, to turn the lights out at 6. So the idea was that from 6 p.m. onwards, there would be no electric light, and we would use candles instead. And then in the daytime, I would try, even though it was the middle of winter, and even though I'm bound to a desk in my work, I would do everything I could to get as much bright light exposure as possible. So that was things like, after the school drop off in the morning, just, sitting in the park with my notepad, doing my to-do list outside rather than at the kitchen table where it's really dark. And, going for a walk around the block, like I said earlier, at regular intervals, trying to eat outdoors. Also, just taking, when I made my breakfast in the morning, just going outside with my cup of tea and just, standing in the garden and eating my cup of tea and my bit of toast. And also swapping kind of indoor exercise. I did quite a lot of exercise, but swapping going to the gym in like a windowless exercise studio for doing the same kind of exercise outdoors. But I had to convince my family to also at least turn out the lights at night. And at the time, I think my kids were kind of 6 and 4. And my
it's not too bad. Still, you can exert you have some influence over them still at that age, I guess.
Well, I could say this is what we're doing, and you're going to have to live with it. But my daughter's response was to burst into tears and say, "Oh, mummy, it's going to be spooky. I don't like the dark." And I kind of said, "Oh no, it'll be lovely. We go camping quite a lot. It'll be just like going camping, like having fires and candles." And she wasn't completely convinced. My son, who's really into Halloween, at first was like, "This will be great." And he also said, "If it's like camping, can we have lots of marshmallows?" So I did a lot of bribing with marshmallows. But actually, by the end of living like this, we did this on off for 6 weeks in the middle of December. Well, it was beginning of December until mid-January. And by the end of it, it was my 6-year-old daughter who was the one who was saying, "I really like it. It's really cozy and nice in the evening to have the lights dimmed." And it was my son who was complaining that he couldn't see his toys and he wanted to watch telly. But it actually was a very positive experience for us.
What was the impact of doing this? So, for you and your husband, sure, but also I'm interested with your kids. Did you notice anything different? Was their mood different? Energy? Were they sleeping better? I mean, what went on with the family?
I was the only one who actually I did a load of tests on myself.
So you objectively tracked your data.
I tracked my data. I didn't track my family's data because it was just too complicated. And my kids go to school and it's difficult to control all that stuff. But I tracked myself very, very extensively. So the impact on me was that, first of all, I felt sleepier earlier in the evening. It was December. It was the run up to Christmas, which is a really sociable time. So we did have quite a lot of guests coming to our house. I think in part out of curiosity to find out what on earth I was doing and what it was like to live with candles. But I was definitely sleepier earlier in the evenings. I wanted to go to bed like at sort of 9, 10 o'clock rather than 11 or 12 o'clock. I didn't always do that because of social obligations, but I wanted to. We also, once a week, we took readings of my melatonin. Now, melatonin is a hormone that you release. It's under the control of the circadian clock, and you release it in the evening at night. And it's basically a kind of biological signal to your whole body that it's time to shift change into night mode. And one thing it does is it impacts on the sleep centers. So it does tend to, you release melatonin and your brain kind of goes, nighttime, it's time to feel sleepy. Here's some sleep signals. And what we found was that I started secreting melatonin between 1.5 and 2 hours earlier than when I lived normally. So that explains why I was feeling sleepier earlier, because my body was saying it's nighttime.
But this is
2 hours earlier.
I mean, for people listening, I just want to emphasize how striking a point you just made. We're talking about a very important hormone in our body. Yes, it's associated with sleep. There are other studies suggesting it's an antioxidant, that it may have some anti-cancer properties, potentially. And, we can maybe explore that later in our conversation, but this is an important hormone that is under this circadian clock that simply by switching off artificial light in the evening, you are shifting maybe 2 hours beforehand. You're changing an important hormone's secretion by 2 hours.
Yes.
That is significant. If a drug was doing that, we'd be talking about it. There would be a list of side effects on it. Yet many of us are doing that every evening on our devices without the awareness of the implications.
Mm-hmm. But the other thing is that I did some weeks where I was turning off the lights in the evening. We did a week where I both turned the lights off and got outdoors more. And we did a week where I didn't worry about my light exposure in the evening. I just got outdoors more in the daytime. And on that week as well, we saw this shift towards earlier melatonin secretion.
So are you saying that even if you didn't, you can mitigate the impact of your sort of artificial light exposure in the evenings by getting more daylight in the day?
Yeah, well, you can shift your clock earlier by getting more daylight in the day. But that German study you mentioned earlier about if you expose people to bright light in the morning, that improves their alertness throughout the day. That also showed that it mitigated the effect of bright light at night on circadian rhythms. So usually if you see bright light at night, it will shift your clocks later. If you see bright light in the daytime, it seems to stop, even if you're exposed to bright light at night, it seems to stop that shift. It's almost like your body locks on to the brightest sort of source of light it sees in that 24-hour cycle and uses that to kind of set its timing.
And that is, for me, that's like I've seen some of this research, and I think that is something that people should really be taking hold of and going, okay, look, trying to get people to reduce their screen exposure in the evening can often be very challenging. God, I know that myself. It's extremely challenging on a regular basis to do that. Now, at least by getting more natural light exposure in the day, you are actually potentially insulating yourself from some of the implications of being on your screens in the evening. So people can almost, how can I put it, have their cake and eat it, right? If they get outside more.
Yes, I think so. But I think you still ideally want to. You don't have to switch off your screens, but you can dim your screens. You can tune out some of the blue light or blue wavelength light, which our circadian system seems to be particularly responsive to. And you can do simple things like, you don't have to get rid of screens and go back to the dark ages and just have candles in your house. You can, just switch off your overhead lights and just switch to like dim table lamps around your home as well. That's going to dim your light exposure. And then if you're combining that with more daylight, then that's going to be better.
Yeah. What did you do? I'm intrigued because, we actually try and do some of these things in our house. The more I read about light, the more I get quite particular on it in the evening. So I don't want these lights from the ceiling on. I just want either candles or dim lights on. But our bathroom has got these big bright LED lights in.
Yeah.
And so obviously it's sort of summery time at the moment. So I tell the kids, you don't need the light on in the bathroom when you're going. But what did you do at night in the bathrooms?
Well, I'm really annoyed about our bathroom lights, actually, because when we moved into our house 5 years ago, we got these dimmable bathroom lights, and they were great because we've got the LED bulbs in the ceiling, and you could pull the cord and it would dim them right down. So that's great. But then there was some problem with them, and our electricians basically said, "Sorry, we can't sort out the dimmer." And now the only thing we have in our bathroom is bright lights, and that's a problem. So I now have this little night light that I use when I go to the bathroom at night. I just put on this little, you just shake it and it comes on, and it's just a dim light in the bathroom so you can see, but it's not this really bright glaring thing. When I was doing my experiment, I think I used candles, which is a bit of a health hazard or
Health
fire
hazard
hazard.
Nights,
Yeah.
We say that, and I guess it is. Before the advent of artificial light, I'm sure that's what people did, right?
Well, yes. Well, I was about to say, I went and stayed with an Amish family in Pennsylvania while I was doing the research for Chasing the Sun, and they have oil lamps in their bathrooms. So, the kind of paraffin, old-fashioned paraffin lamps. That's what they tend to use.
There you go. Well, we're gonna go to that. Let's just close off your experiment. So you were noticing big changes.
Oh, yes. So I also tracked. I did these kind of mood and alertness questionnaires just before I went to bed each night and when I woke up in the morning. And the main thing I saw from that is that on the weeks when I was doing these interventions, like cutting out light and getting more daylight, I was waking up raring to go. I was waking up alert and my morning mood was much better. But then the impact on the rest of my family. So we didn't track them in as much detail, but definitely my husband commented on how nice it was in the evenings and how he just felt more relaxed. My daughter at the end of this whole ordeal was, saying, I really like it. It's really relaxed. People who came to our house to visit, in fact, we had a New Year's Eve party in the dark. And apart from, nearly giving our guests food poisoning because we couldn't see if we'd cooked the beef burgers and nearly chopping my finger off. Apart from those things which, living with candles are problems. They also commented, we had some friends who'd been at another party first and then they came to our house and they said, wow, it's really chilled out here in a really good way.
Yeah.
People behave differently when the lights are low, I think. And the other thing on that New Year's Eve party that everyone commented on was we had quite a lot of people over. And so we've all got young children. So a lot of people put their kids to bed upstairs in our house. And, usually you've got kids. If you try and put like a load of sort of 3 to 8 year olds to bed en masse in a room,
they're not asleep 3 hours later.
They'll still be up at midnight. But they were, I kid you not, they were all asleep by 9 o'clock.
You know what? It is so interesting to hear that because I really do feel that light influences, it exerts such an influence on the way we are, our moods, our sleep levels, our alertness. So much is influenced by lights. And I just don't think we've taken it seriously enough. I remember coming across some of this research a few years ago when my kids were young. My kids would always get up super early and they always wanted a nightlight on in the hall or in their room, which was a white nightlight. And a few years ago when I was researching this and I came across that red light has less of an impact on our circadian rhythms than white light or blue light. And so I thought, okay, fine. So I bought a red bulb and put that as a night light. And I'm not kidding you, instantaneously. And again, this is not a scientific experiment. This is just my experience of this. My kids were sleeping an hour later every morning consistently. And I thought, so in my head, I was thinking, this is not a coincidence. Their night light has changed from white to red, and it felt as though it was no longer altering their circadian rhythm, so they were sleeping for longer. And it's just something. It's interesting to reflect on that and then hear the story about when you don't have artificial light in the evening, you put all these kids together en masse, and they all fall asleep. It really makes me reflect on, have we missed over the last 20, 30 years, in all our discussions on health, have we missed a big part, a big piece in the jigsaw? Could our exposure to light potentially be more important than the food that we eat?
I don't think we know the answer to that yet, but I think certainly it's been underappreciated. And also, it's really worth just reflecting on the fact that, we take light at night for granted. It's only 140 years since Thomas Edison invented the incandescent light bulb. Before that, we had gas lights for, a few decades before that. But, it was in the early 1800s and that's only just over 200 years ago that light in the evening was a thing. Before then, all we had were like tallow candles or whale oil lamps, which most people couldn't afford, or firelight. And so most people went to bed not long after the sun went down. They stayed up a little while around fires and so on, but they didn't have artificial light. And our biology is set up for there to be darkness at night.
It's amazing to hear how malleable our body clocks are, because you made the change and experiment with your own family and you're suddenly feeling sleepier than you normally are. When my wife started wearing these blue light blocking glasses that I got her in the evening, so even if she went on her laptop and she put her blue light blocking glasses on, I think for a week at 7 p.m, by 7:30, she was yawning her head off and thinking, and normally she could stay up till 10, 10:30.
Yeah.
And so suddenly by blocking light exposure, you're almost allowing your body to return to its natural rhythm. And I think this has got implications. We've obviously talked about night owls and morning larks. And what I find interesting about this is that I accept that there are different chronotypes. But I also think that some people believe themselves to be night owls, whereas they're actually larks, but they're using light to shift their rhythm. This is just what I've seen with friends and with some patients where they've always sworn that they're night owls, and as they start to change their light exposure, they find actually that they're morning larks. So I just wonder what your view on that is.
Yeah, well, I always thought I was a night owl. And then I got chronotyped. I went, these university. In fact, I was making a documentary for the BBC about chronotypes and night owls and larks. So I got chronotyped myself, which involves doing this questionnaire. I discovered that I'm an intermediate type. So actually, it's a spectrum. You're not one or the other. But I'm kind of somewhere in the middle between these extremes. But doing this experiment made me realize actually I'm far more of a morning person if I let myself be. Than I give myself credit for.
When did you do this experiment? Was it last Christmas?
It was 2 Christmases ago, might even be 3 Christmases ago.
Okay, so we're at least 2 years past it. So given that you've written a book on this, right, and you researched it and you know the implications, I just would love to get an idea that sometimes we know the right thing to do, but the modern world makes it hard for us to practice what we know. And that forget light for a minute, that goes for anything, where even eating the right way or moving enough, we're always fighting against it in the environment in which we live. So with all your knowledge, with your research, with your own experience, what has managed to stick in you and your family's lifestyle from over 2 years ago?
Yeah, dimming the lights in the evening. We still use quite a lot of candles, actually. We still tend to light candles when we have dinner. I have realized that just using candles is completely impractical. For one thing, there's the air pollution worry, because, you're releasing a load of soot into your house.
Right.
But you can get, so I've installed these color changing light bulbs, dimmable color changing smart light bulbs. So I use them particularly in our kitchen. And particularly over our kitchen island. So I can kind of, I can filter out all the blue light in the evening and make things quite dim. And then, add in candles when we're sitting down for dinner. And then daytime, I exercise outdoors now.
Yeah.
I used to be a real gym bunny. And now so this morning, even though it was raining this morning, and I went out and did this HIIT class in the park with a load of other women in the rain. And I felt brilliant afterwards. So those are the kind of two big things. Like I said, I'm kind of working on trying to have a more regular sleep-wake cycle. I don't always achieve it. But when I don't achieve it, I'm more mindful of how I feel the next day, and I kind of go, I really need to stop doing this. But it is difficult.
I think the two things you mentioned, I mean, the gym and exercising outdoors, again, is something that I think I've started to shift to more and more over the last few years. Again, I would go to the gym quite a bit, and I just don't want to really anymore. I mean, I'll go occasionally, but I think, I'm drawn to movement and the natural environment more now. I know the benefits of nature. I know, all the studies on that. But at the same time, with the circadian biology research, actually, I should try and get outdoors as much as I can.
Yeah.
And I think there's something freeing about running or exercising in the rain when you know that. Actually, it actually feels great as well afterwards. You feel like you've really conquered the elements.
Yeah.
So that's something I can totally resonate with. And
yeah. I'll tell you the other thing I've really done is I've taken up wild swimming. So there's a lake in North Bristol. Yeah.
This is
and I'm completely addicted to it.
Oh my God, I can't believe you're saying that. The last 3 months, I did it for the first time in Bantham about in the middle of June.
Yeah.
I was scared out of my wits, and I'm hooked now. I'm utterly hooked.
Yeah. You've got to start doing it in the winter. So
I look forward to it.
Yeah.
Where do you go?
There's a lake in North Bristol called Henley's Lake, and it has this kind of old school, I guess it's an Edwardian kind of swimming club. It's just celebrated its centenary, actually. And they have a little sauna there. So when I was researching the book, I went up to Scandinavia to kind of figure out how they deal with the winter. And one thing I noticed in Sweden was that they're really into saunas and jumping in, into the Baltic Sea afterwards, which is completely freezing, and you get this big endorphin rush. But also I went up to Tromsø in the far north of Norway, where given the latitude, you'd expect there to be a really high prevalence of seasonal affective disorder, and there isn't. And so there was a study into why this might be, and what that found was that it could be to do with people's mindset up there, their mindset. So they have far more positive attitudes to winter compared to people in the south of Norway. And I started thinking, well, that's really interesting. I think I need, because I get a bit miserable in the winter, and my mum definitely does. And I kind of went, well, I really need to find some things to start looking forward to in the winter time. And outdoor swimming, maybe I could do that in the winter and get that like sauna endorphin rush as well. So last winter, I like once a week would go down to Henley's Lake and get really hot in the sauna, go into the lake, completely freeze, and then get back in the sauna. And it was brilliant.
Some of my best mates live in Bristol, actually. And I think, if they're listening now, I'll be coming down this winter, guys, to stay. And we'll all go to the lake. Henley's Lake, is it?
Henley's Lake, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to try that. So you mentioned this place in Norway you went to. Is it the whole of Norway that doesn't get affected by seasonal affective disorder, or just this particular spot?
Just this particular spot. And also I think Spitsbergen. But then people who go to Spitsbergen have got to be a little bit crazy. Anyway, this is like in the far north.
So this spot, what's it called again?
Tromsø.
So tell me a little bit about Tromsø. What's going on there? Why have they got a positive mindset? Is there something historical that's led to that?
So Tromsø's in the Arctic Circle. Generally, the further north you go, the higher the prevalence of seasonal affective disorder is. Interestingly, the Amish are again, we talked about Amish light exposure, so they don't have electric light, but they also spend a lot more of their daytimes outdoors because a lot of them are agricultural workers. The women tend to tend large gardens. They grow their own food, and they like walk or scoot around because they're not allowed to drive cars, and they have the lowest prevalence of seasonal affective disorder of any Caucasian population studied so far, which also suggests that our light exposure might have something to do with this. But certainly the further north you go generally, the higher the prevalence of SAD is. There does seem to be a little bit of a genetic adaptation. So if you look at the population of Iceland, they also seem to buck this trend a little bit. And there was a study that found that people of Icelandic descent living in a little area of Canada had a lower prevalence of SAD compared to other Canadians living nearby. But yeah, if you go to Tromsø, they also seem to buck this trend, even though the rest of Norway, people in the south don't like winter so much. And this psychological study was like set up to try and figure out what it is about people in Tromsø. And they found that they have this positive winter mindset. So in Tromsø, between kind of early December and mid-January, the sun doesn't come up above the horizon. I went there I think it was about sort of the 10th to 15th of January. And so the sun was on the verge of coming back, but it wasn't quite back. So it was a very weird experience, actually. In the morning, there was light. It felt like the sun was about to come up. And you know that if you're ever out just sort of before dawn, just before the sun comes up, it's kind of like quite a magical time.
Yeah, for sure.
And it felt like that in the mornings, and the light was quite pinkish. And I think another big thing about Tromsø is they have a lot of snow. So you've got this kind of pinkish light bouncing off the snow. A lot of the houses are painted white. So actually it's a kind of quite magical place in the winter. And then you get kind of towards noon and you're still kind of like, oh, any minute now the sun's going to come up, and then suddenly it starts to get darker again.
Wow.
And it really messes with your perception of time. So I remember thinking I was booked in to go and see the Northern Lights that evening, and I was spending the day walking around Tromsø interviewing people and getting a sense of what it's like to live without the sun. And I'd arranged with my Airbnb host that I was going to borrow some cross-country skis and kind of go off cross-country skiing. Yeah. And I suddenly was like, oh my God, I don't have enough time. I've got to go and see the Northern Lights like really soon. And then I looked at my phone at the time and it was only about 2 p.m.
But you felt it was like 5 or 6 p.m.
I felt like it was sort of 6 or 7 actually. And I needed, and just that lack of sun and the fact it was getting dark so quickly.
And wonder if the locals feel that as well, because I guess your whole mindset and perception of time is based around presumably being in the UK. So at that time of year, that the sun starts to set around 4 or half 4, and so I wonder if people who live there all the time have started to adjust to that.
I think they have, but they very much see those dark times as special times. They kind of embrace this whole concept of koselig or kos, which is basically coziness.
I love it.
And so they kind of go, okay. And I interviewed a Sami reindeer hunter, Sami reindeer herder, kind of indigenous people of the far north. And he said, yeah, well, we accept that we are different people in the winter and the spring and the summer and the autumn. And he said, in the winter, I don't feel very sociable. I don't want to go out and see people, but I just, I enjoy spending time indoors by the fire. And with close friends, with close family. And then in the summer, and then my Airbnb host also said this, she said, in summer, people are crazy. We go out hiking in the mountains at 2 a.m. People are different and they accept those differences, but they also get on with things. They also, because they're forced to, everyone has cross-country skis. You see people running with head torches, because it's dark and they want to get some exercise. So they go out running with their head torches. They have these cross-country ski tracks that are all floodlit. Children's playgrounds are floodlit. So, you've got kids climbing around on climbing frames in the dark, but they can see because there's lights. And they just get on with things, really. I
mean, for me, there's so many take-homes from that. I mean, one take-home might be that maybe we can reframe the way we view winter and autumn and dark nights. And, if as a parent of young kids, I'm very conscious of the language I use around them, thinking, for example, it's something I've mentioned on the podcast before. I grew up when my parents are immigrants from India. They've grown up in very hot, sunny climates and come to the UK. And I very much, if the weather was bad, I wouldn't want to go outside. I want to stay indoors. I've flipped, gone the other way with my kids. And, if it's weekend time, like, it's raining, oh, brilliant, we can go out and get wet and muddy and really try and use language so that I don't start to condition them in a way that, hey, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. I'm just trying my best, like all parents are. Yeah. But it makes me think maybe we and any parents listening, we could take that approach for winter and go, hey, look, it's going to be dark, it's going to be cold. What are the cool things that we can do now?
Yeah. No, I think so. And there's some interesting research coming out of a lab in America looking at using cognitive behavioral therapy for seasonal affective disorder. So basically, trying to challenge people's perceptions of winter and basically, rephrase winter. So rather than kind of going, I hate winter, I can't do anything in winter, rather like framing that as winter's a bit more challenging. I have to think harder and work harder to find things that I enjoy, but I can still do it if I put some effort into it. And these studies of CBT for SAD suggest that actually it can be as effective as light therapy, and the effects of it might be more long lasting than light therapy.
So although your book's about chasing the sun and sunlight, it's sort of, what I'm getting is that mindset plays a role here as well, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yes, it's light exposure, but it's also our mindsets as we go into these things. Super, super fascinating that you've got to visit these areas and actually experience that. It sounds magical, actually, the thought of actually experiencing that sort of pink hue of light and the sun not going over the horizon.
It's totally beautiful, and I'd love to go back again. In fact, I want to go back in the middle of summer as well.
I'm already thinking, that might be a nice thing to go and do this winter at some point. So I'll have a look, see what flights are like there. It sounds cold as well.
It's pretty cold. But it's beautiful.
Yeah, it sounds fantastic.
I was actually reminded, all this stuff reminded me of a thing. I had a Swedish friend when my babies were little, called Hannah Gronberg, and she taught me this phrase that there's no such thing as bad weather, only inappropriate clothing. And I completely agree. And doing my experiment and kind of getting outdoors more in winter also taught me that. I do now, like, in winter, I try and get out, and I just put on more layers and lots of waterproof clothes and get out there. And also, really, actually, winter, we often look out the window and go, oh, God, it looks horrible and cold and grey and gloomy. But once you get out there, it's not as bad as you think it is. And often it's really beautiful.
It really is.
And, your parks and places are often deserted, so you have the whole space to yourself.
Yeah, no, for sure. I wonder if these are problems that affect people in the equator as much, in the sense that, in the equator, typically the weather would be a lot better. I guess people would naturally go outside more in the daytime, just because the weather lends itself to that. Of course, it could be too hot at certain times, but I wonder if there's many other factors to consider, of course, but even if they are getting modernized and being on their screens in the evening and exposing themselves to artificial light, I wonder, has the impact been less on them because of the fact that they're getting so much natural sunlight in the day? Do you know anything on that at all?
I don't know about that, but one thing I would say actually is that let's forget about light exposure at night. But one big problem that's emerging in those countries is vitamin D deficiency, because everyone's spending so much more time indoors, and because the darker your skin is, the more time you need to spend outdoors to make vitamin D. So vitamin D deficiency is a growing problem in those more southerly countries.
Yeah, and you would never expect that, because you think they've got all this sun out there, and it's the same, my family from India, it's the same thing there. And it's interesting actually that culturally, from my parents' generation, they never wanted to be out in the sun. So, I always want to go out in the sun, and my folks wouldn't want to go out in the sun, particularly my mum wouldn't want to go out in the sun. And it's sort of bizarre, because we're the other way actually here. When the sun's out, we want to get outside and enjoy it. And I think if you've grown up with it, certainly culturally, there's many other reasons for why they might want to stay inside, which is, it's just super fascinating.
Yeah. And actually, one thing I think I should say, because I've been talking about all this importance of getting outdoors, I certainly wouldn't advocate that people get outdoors and go out without sunscreen and just, bake themselves, because the sun is a double-edged sword. Sunlight is really important for synchronizing our circadian rhythms and so on, but it still does, too much of it does raise your risk of skin cancer. So I think you have to be careful of that. I think the other thing to say actually about light exposure and countries like India, and particularly China, is that there's this growing epidemic of short-sightedness among children, because kids are increasingly spending so much of their time indoors in lessons, particularly in China, and also Singapore. There's a lot of these East Asian countries where there's this big boom in short-sightedness, and it's because we need to be exposed to a certain amount of bright light during the daytime for our eyes to develop properly. And if you're indoors the whole time, your eyeballs basically elongate, and so you're more likely to become short-sighted. I mean, the prevalence of myopia has reached about 90% in some of these countries. It's really terrifying.
It really is terrifying. It's interesting for me that from your experiment a couple of years ago, one of the things you as a family do now is you use modern technology to help replicate natural environments. So you've got these cool dimmer lights, and you can move the red wavelength of light out, which sounds amazing.
Get rid of the blue at night.
Which is brilliant, because that's presumably what we're going to evolve more and more to, is we're going to see all these companies actually start creating lighting solutions that make it easier for us to live in the modern world, but also to try and replicate what's going on outside as much as possible. But obviously, we mentioned the Amish a couple of times here. And, you know, I remember reading this bit in the book, and it's so interesting that you actually went and spent some time with the Amish. So the Amish are a community who, you know, still live, from what I understand, very much in a way that they have lived for many years. And I wonder if you could share your experience of living with the Amish, but also how did that come about?
Yeah. Well, like I said, I was interested in this whole thing about electric light at night, first of all. And I wanted to find some communities that didn't have light at night. So there have been various studies suggesting that if you look at tribal societies in, say, Tanzania or Bolivia, that they go to bed earlier and wake up earlier than we do in the West. But those are kind of, they're not equatorial countries, but they're a lot closer to the equator than we are in Britain, say.
Yeah.
And also they live in very different conditions, very, very basic conditions. And so I was like, I wonder if I can find a community or a society further north, like more akin to North Americans or British people who live in kind of fairly comfortable conditions and more similar to we do, but who just don't have electricity. So I started like thinking about off-grid communities and that kind of thing and doing lots of searching in the sort of medical literature. And I came across a couple of studies by a researcher called Theodore Postolaki at the University of Maryland who'd been looking at the Amish. And I was like, oh, the Amish, I don't know much about them. And he was very interested in their light exposure. So actually, I remember I was in Norway when I finally managed to connect with Theodore over Skype, and we had this really fascinating conversation, actually very late at night, about light and the Amish. And I said, well, you know, I'm going to be coming to the US because some other things I did in the book was do some stuff like I met with an American submariner because you know they spend months without any exposure to sun. So I said, well, I'm going to be coming to the US, and I was reading your papers and thinking about going and staying with an Amish family to experience what it's like to live without artificial light. I found a couple of B&Bs and they said I can come and stay with them. And he said, yeah, but you know, they're not like real Amish. You're not going to get the authentic Amish experience because they're used to having visitors. They've been granted a kind of special dispensation by their community to be allowed to have visitors. The whole thing about the Amish, the whole reason they live off grid is because they're trying to keep the outside world out. They're trying to insulate themselves from the modern world. So they're not opposed to electricity per se. They do have like rechargeable battery operated power tools in their workshops and stuff, but they don't want artificial. They don't want electricity to, you know, bring things like radio, television, the internet, which they feel will.
They don't use cars either, right? Do they? So
No.
I've heard that's because they don't want to fragment their communities, and if people
Absolutely.
have got a way
keep people close. Yeah.
You know what? I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's interesting, isn't it, that we might consider them to be quite extreme relative to how we live. Yet, you know, we now are seeing in the scientific literature the importance of community. Yeah. The Amish have community.
Yeah.
We're now seeing the implications of these fragmented societies we're living in, the stress, the sort of health implications, you know, mental health problems are on the rise. And again, you're saying that in the Amish, they've got, what was it, the lowest rate of seasonal affective disorder in any Caucasian population. Yeah. So although we may, not myself, but I say we, a collective, we may look at them as living very different lives to us that we may not enjoy. On many metrics, they're doing pretty well, aren't they?
Yeah, and I tell you what, their dads are more involved in the child rearing as well.
Really?
So one way I really connected with this Amish family. So wow. What I'll tell you, I'll finish my story. So what happened was that I contacted this researcher, Theodore Postolaki, and he said, you don't want to go and stay in an Amish B&B. I tell you what, I'll connect you with this woman, Hannah, who is my Amish liaison person. So he conducts he doesn't just do light studies with the Amish, he also does genetic studies. Yeah. And they have this medical center in Pennsylvania, in the middle of Amish land. And they go out and they collect blood samples and so on and study the genetics of Amish people. So he works with this Amish woman called Hannah, and he said, I'll just ask her if she'd be prepared to have this British journalist come and stay with her family for the weekend. And I had to basically I had to basically, he made a massive leap of trust in me, because he said, they're very sensitive about people's perceptions of them. And I need to have your word that you're just going to go there to interview them about their light and sleep. And you're not going to start asking them about schooling and all that kind of thing. And I said, no, I'm just a bit like fixated on light and sleep. I just want to find out about this. So we set this up, and I flew out, landed in New York, and the next day, Theodore Postolake's daughter, who just graduated from high school, picked me up in her dad's massive truck and drove me out to Pennsylvania. And we picked Hannah up at a farmer's market on the way, because the Amish are not allowed to drive cars, but they are allowed to accept lifts from other people.
Wow.
And when she saw this massive truck, she was really, her eyes lit up, because she was like, it's Memorial Day weekend, which is like a bank holiday weekend. And there's loads of yard sales, and you've just brought a massive truck so I can buy stuff and move stuff around. So that's what we did. So when I went to bed that night, and she said, what do you want to do while you're here? And I said, I literally want to stalk you. I just want to follow you around and see what you do over the course of these 2 or 3 days, and ask you some questions, and ask, other people you interact with about their sleep and their light exposure. And she was like, okay, well, tomorrow we're going yard sale shopping, and we're going to get up at the same time we usually do, which is 4:30. Is that okay with you? And I went, that's fine, because I've just come from the UK, so that's about 9:30. I'll be wide awake.
Yes.
So it actually worked well with my jet lag. But, we got up. They got up, as they always do, had breakfast at sort of 4:45, and then went out and went to these yard sales, which, car boot sales. And the whole Amish community were out and about at sort of 5 or 6 in the morning. It was really strange, but lovely. It was really nice. And I met lots of people, interviewed lots of Amish people. What struck me was that they do still have chronotypes. There are definitely still people who identify as night owls. But if you ask them, well, when would you like to go to sleep and when would you like to wake up? I remember there was this woman called Katie Baylor who's like, oh yeah, everyone thinks I'm so lazy because I just want to sleep in, but I have to get up for my husband. And I said, well, when would you ideally go to bed? She was like, 10 p.m. I know it's so late. I'm like, oh, okay. When would you like to get up? 6 a.m.
So that's her definition of late according
She's
to
a
her
night
society.
owl, according to her society. Yeah, which is really interesting.
It just blows my mind hearing all this, just the way different people live. And, did you...
Oh, no, that's what I was going to say about the whole acceptance within the family and how I managed to connect with this Amish family. So Hannah was dead lovely, and she was really, friendly. And I guess she's used to working with non-Amish people because she's, she works with Teo Postolake. But her husband was a lot more, at least at first, kind of like you could see him being kind of quite shy, like, I'm not sure what's going on here. Her daughter-in-law especially was really... She was just kind of, I remember being sat in the back of the truck with her on the way to this yard sale, and she wouldn't look at me. She was really like on edge, and who is this and what's she doing, and who is, because they have no contact, they have very little contact with people from outside their community. So they were very mistrustful. And the way we began to be friends and really engage was when I talked about the fact that both me and my husband are freelance journalists, and we share joint childcare. So we both kind of work more or less a 4-day week, and we've always tried to share the childcare equally. And Ben, the husband in this relationship, was like, well, that's what we do. I've always been really involved with my kids, and he was really fascinated. He was really fascinated by this idea that my husband also kind of like pitched in and did his
because his perception was that
in the West it's not like that. Yeah,
isn't that interesting? Because you wouldn't. I don't think typically people would think that about the Amish. They'd think,
no. Well, because the dads work very close to home. They're quite in and out of the house all day. So they have big families as well. So they're involved in their children's lives in a way that fathers in our society often aren't. And I think that thing of having, and also, their like parents live 2 doors down, and it is a much closer community. And I think that's right. I think there are probably lessons we can learn from these communities about, reflect on our own lives.
You mentioned there's a section in your book, I can't remember where you talk about how in some societies there's no term or word for insomnia.
Yeah.
And I mean, are the Amish one of those that you came across?
No, I think that was it might be the Hadza in Tanzania. Yeah,
Yeah.
which are, a tribe in rural Tanzania.
It reminds me of I can't remember who gave this. It was I think it was a psychology professor. When I was either a medical student or a junior doctor, I went to this really amazing talk by someone, and he was saying how these words that we take for granted, like indigestion or heartburn or gas, said in some societies around the world they don't have words for them. They just don't exist because they either don't experience them or their perception of it is completely different. So they don't have a word for it. And isn't it amazing how language is so telling on this, that if in our culture we don't have a word for something, it's possibly because it's not an issue or it's accepted as norm. And can you imagine if we didn't have a word for insomnia in English, given the way society is set up at the moment?
Yeah.
It's mad, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
It's super fascinating. You touched on social jet lag. You've also just mentioned jet lag. And I really want to sort of go in here because I think it's super interesting for people. Many people, of course, not everyone, have experienced jet lag at some point. And you talk about how NASA and the space station are really drilled in on how you best manage jet lag because they've spent so much time and money getting these astronauts ready.
Yeah.
You can't let something as simple as jet lag, waste time or efficiencies, right? So I wonder if you could expand a bit on that.
Yeah, jet lag or sleep deprivation. They're well aware that there have been, like the space shuttle disasters, which have been related, and it's not just space actually, but a lot of big industrial disasters have been like linked to sleep deprivation, or they've occurred in the middle of the night when people are, working the night shift. So they're really like, we need to do everything we can to make sure our astronauts are well rested, don't have jet lag, and are as alert as they possibly and are as I can't speak, and I'm obviously not very alert.
Social jet lag, right there.
Alert as they possibly can be when they're on duty. So yeah, I mean, on the US part of the International Space Station, NASA has refitted the lights to try and do just that, to help its astronauts cope with the fact that, because space is a really weird environment, and that the sun rises, I can't remember how often it is. I think
several
it's
times a day, isn't it?
No, it's more than that. I think it rises every 90 minutes because
Wow.
It's a weird environment. So if you're kind of, and it tends to be very dim on the inside of the International Space Station. So if you are kind of like in this dim environment, and then suddenly you get this like brilliant flash of light every 90 minutes, that can really mess up your circadian rhythms and leave you in this kind of permanently desynchronized state.
Yeah.
So they have been doing a lot of work on trying to strengthen athletes' rhythms. So one thing they have is that when did I say athletes? I mean astronauts.
Astronaut, yeah.
When the astronauts go to sleep, they do so in these little kind of coffin-like pods, and in there they have these lights, and they can put them into different modes. But they, in the run up to sleep, they put them on a kind of dim amber kind of setting to help them, wind down and get ready for sleep. And then when they wake up first thing in the morning, whatever morning is up there, they put it on the like really bright wake up setting. But NASA also invests a lot in their astronauts when they're on the ground. And actually some of the same scientists who are involved in the research on astronauts and work with astronauts also work very closely with professional athletes and sports teams to help them mitigate jet lag.
That's huge, isn't it? And particularly in America, where they've got the 3 time zones and different teams playing other teams in the wrong time zone.
It's been shown that jet lag can really impair athletic performance. So, I wish that airlines would take this issue as seriously as NASA and these athletic teams.
Well, it's good, isn't it a good thing that when NASA are doing this research and they're changing light tones and textures for their astronauts in space, at some point that's going to filter down.
I think it will. I think it's happening very, very slowly. So, one thing they do, you can make jet lag go away a lot faster than it does normally by optimizing your light exposure.
So tell me about how do you make jet lag go away?
Well, It's a bit complicated, but I'll do my best.
Well, I'll tell you what, to make this really practical, in about 3 weeks, I'm flying from Manchester to LA.
Okay.
And my flight is at 1 p.m. from Manchester Airport, UK time, and I arrive at 4 p.m. LA time.
So if you're flying from, you said from Manchester to LA in the afternoon, UK time, there's two kind of things that matter. The first thing you will always need to be thinking about is what time is it according to your body clock. So when you're flying to LA, even though you're traveling to a different country, your body is still on British time. Okay. And there's the other thing you have to get your head around is that light in the evening and at night delays your clock or makes you more of a night owl. And light kind of soon after you wake up in the morning makes you more of an early bird. It advances the clock. So if you're flying west to America, say, you want to delay your body clock. You want to become more of a night owl because, evening in LA is the middle of the night in the UK. So if you want to be able to stay up until like 10 at night, you need to be more night owlish, basically.
So basically, I want to delay my body clock,
Yeah.
which means I need to limit light in the morning and expose myself to more light in the evening.
According to where your body clock is.
Right.
Yeah.
So not on LA time, on UK time.
On UK time initially, and then gradually as you adapt, you need to kind of adapt your light exposure as well.
So you go, I'm still on UK time, but I want to delay my body clock. What do I need to do to delay my body clock?
You need to be seeing light at night and in the evening UK time. And that's easy if you're flying to LA because when you get off the plane, it's going to be daytime in LA. So you're seeing light according to your body clock in the middle of the night.
So that's why going west is easier than going east because you naturally...
It's one reason why it's easier.
One reason.
Yeah.
And I don't know your view on blue light blocking glasses, but I've always struggled with jet lag, but I was all right on my last trip to the west coast of America because I can't remember what time my flight was, but I think as soon as I got on the flight, I put on these really harsh red blocking glasses. I didn't watch the in-flight entertainment, I think is the word. And halfway into the flight, when I thought it was around 7, 8 a.m. in LA, I then started to take those glasses off and started to expose myself.
Ahead of the curve. So let's talk about coming back in the opposite direction.
Yeah, but that actually worked.
Yeah.
That properly worked more than it had ever done before. And I thought...
It really does.
But I changed a couple of things as well, like my caffeine intake. And I thought, okay, it's one of these two things or a bit of both.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the other way. So coming east.
So the other way is the real challenge. And sorry, the glasses look red, but they're blocking the blue light. And then when you're going in the opposite direction... It's the opposite. You're wanting to advance your body clock, which means you want to be, and by now you'll be on LA time, so your body clock is LA time. And that means that you need to be seeing light from kind of 7 a.m. LA time onwards to advance your body clock. And you need to be avoiding it, really importantly, in the night, LA time.
What's different about this for me is that it's a big shift in thinking. So you're not thinking about your new body clock in your new time zone. You're saying, I'm going there, but actually, what is my existing body clock? Do I need to push it forward or push it back?
Exactly.
If I need to push it forward, I do A and B. If I want to push it back, I do A and B. But you do it on your existing body clock.
Yes.
It's actually, once you get your head around it, it's quite simple.
It is quite simple, but it's a bit, you have to change. Yeah, you have to think about what time is my body on at the moment. So when you're going back east, when you're flying from LA to Manchester, you're trying to advance your body clock. And kind of typically what happens is people fly overnight for that flight.
I am flying overnight. I'm leaving at 6:30 in the evening and I arrive in Manchester at 12:30, so lunchtime.
Okay.
So when I arrive at lunchtime in Manchester... Actually, LA is 8 hours back, so it's going to be 4 a.m. in LA. So
it's the middle of the night in LA. So the last thing you want to be doing is getting off the flight in Manchester and suddenly seeing a load of bright light because it's the nighttime. You're trying to advance your body clock, and that's going to delay your body clock. So what you really want is to wear a pair of really dark wraparound sunglasses for that whole flight, and then especially when you get off the plane in Manchester, and keep them on until your body clock reaches about 7 a.m. Then you can take them off and get as much light as possible because that will help you advance.
Brilliant.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, love it.
So there's Stephen Lockley, who's one of these researchers who works with NASA astronauts and also these elite sports teams. And he did this for me as well, actually. He basically creates a kind of a sleep plan, a light plan. It's not just a sleep plan, it's a light plan, almost like a light prescription of when precisely you should be seeing light and when you should be avoiding light and when you should be taking melatonin and that kind of thing. And he's just recently launched an app. There are various apps now that will tell you about when you should be seeing light and avoiding light. The principles are quite simple once you get your head around it, but like it does require a bit of thinking, and some of it's quite counterintuitive. Like you don't, that advice that you just live in your new time zone can sometimes really backfire and just,
well, I've sorted. I've kind of cracked after many years of trying going west.
Yeah.
So now, with your new advice, I'm going to try and crack going east on my way back.
Yeah. Well, my friend Dickie's actually, he's the guitarist in the sort of 1980s band Scritti Politti.
Right.
And he was flying to Japan to do a Japan tour.
Yeah.
And it was when I was writing the book, and I said, I tell you what, I'm going to try and. Can I try and write you a jet lag plan based on what I've learned from Stephen Lockley? And I did it. And he said, he was like, I did it and it worked really well. And the rest of the band were completely floored with jet lag and I was fine. So I think it does make it, and I've definitely, since I learned all this, it's changed how I deal with jet lag, and it does make it much better.
And this is ultimately air travel's not going away. We love it too much. We love exploring different parts of the world.
Yeah.
And it's kind of funny because on the way out there, I always go out to work. So I'm very busy when I'm out there, getting up early on my old times. It's not a problem. You can use caffeine and coffee to keep going and you can sort of get through the days.
Yeah.
It's coming back. So I come home to family life and kids and work routines. And it's sometimes you're flawed in the morning. You're just not with it at all. So I think that's really interesting. And I think when people read your book, when they understand the principles, it's not that tricky to kind of figure it out. Yeah. But also you need a strong will, right? Because as we were saying earlier on in the podcast, often we find the environment in which we're in too challenging to make behavior. So a lot of people will go, yeah, but I'm just not going to wear these kind of wacky glasses from 7 a.m. when I land to 3 p.m. Yeah. Now, I will. I would actually do that.
I have no shame. I mean, I was walking around the air cabin and going to the toilet with shades on, and the air crew were a bit like, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, let me tell you about what's wrong with your plane.
But it is.
They found it really fascinating, because they really, aircrew completely have these issues with jet lag, and they worry about this shift working thing. And when I explained it, they were like, "Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I understand why you're wearing dark glasses to the toilet. That's quite weird, but now we understand."
We actually have a lot of aircrew listening to this podcast because I get lots of messages from cabin crew saying, oh, this and that, and they worry about their jobs. So if anyone is listening to this, they have a boss at Virgin or BA and they want to come on and talk on the podcast about this and how you can change lighting to better serve your employees, basically, so that they can function better. There's less of a risk to their health. Please get in touch. We would be delighted to have that conversation, because I think it's super important.
Well, I would as well. Yeah, I do. And actually hospitals are starting to take this on board as well. There have been a few really interesting studies looking at trying to improve the light environment in hospitals to strengthen patients' circadian rhythms and try and help them recover faster.
Look, there's no question that we're having a bit of a joke about jet lag and glasses and stuff. This is serious. This is super serious stuff, because our society has moved on. We do live in a 24-hour society. Some of the people who help us the most in society, ambulances, firefighters, shift workers, nurses in hospitals, or and the list goes on. Porters in hospitals, actually, in many ways, are putting their health at risk by doing these jobs. And I think as a progressive society, we need to start taking this seriously. We need to think about some solutions for these workers who are helping us. Security staff. Yeah. It is quite tragic, isn't it, that these are the people in society who often are taking the brunt off this.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that work's ongoing. And I think the thing is, we need shift workers. We need shift work.
Yeah.
We need, like you say, we need people to
Society's moved on now.
Yeah. We can't really go back to, and it does enable us to be more productive if we can work shifts.
Yeah.
But we need to find a way to help shift workers. There's some really interesting work going on, again, in America. Again, actually, so Stephen Lockley's at Harvard and Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. There's also some really interesting research going on there about whether you could, given that people have to work the night shift, what can you do to mitigate the effects of that on people's health? So they are looking at whether meal timing could make it have a bit less of a negative impact on health. So the idea here is that, one problem with working the night shift, apart from being exposed to light in the middle of the night, is that you tend to eat in the middle of the night as well. And so, like I said earlier, meal timing can also affect the timing of your clocks in all your organs and tissues. And so maybe if you avoid eating overnight and snacking overnight, even if you have to stay up all night and work the night shift, that's going to have less of an impact on your rhythms and cause less havoc and desynchrony than if you're both seeing light at the wrong time, staying up overnight and also eating and just perpetuating this desynchrony.
I mean, I think this work's going to be ongoing. I think the field is accelerating. It has to. And as more and more research comes out, perhaps we can continue this conversation at some point.
Yeah, well, I'd love to. Yeah.
Because it really is fascinating. You've written a brilliant, brilliant book. I can't recommend it enough. I think people will learn a lot and they'll find it very fascinating and interesting as they read it. As a sort of final thought from me, I can't help but think that, your book's about the sun, right? It's a brilliant title, Chasing the Sun. But in many ways, this is reflective of how, as humans living these modern lives, we've lost our connection to the natural world. The sun is one part of that. We've also lost connection to our food supply. We've lost connection to so many more things than just the sun. I think the sun almost epitomizes it, but it's just reflective of you mentioned before about these different seasons and how we almost try and override these seasons. I think you mentioned in your story, you met some people in Scandinavia who, they hibernate in the winter. They don't go out much. They don't feel like socializing, but they embrace it.
Yeah.
Right? They embrace it and recognize that actually, we've got different seasons. So maybe our behavior should be different in different seasons. Maybe we shouldn't try and override nature and make sure, even to the point of, eating ripe fruit and blueberries in the summer, yet we're still having it with our Christmas pudding now because we can buy blueberries from Kenya in December. It goes far beyond sunlight for me. Sunlight, of course, is important, but I think we've lost our connection to the natural world.
Yes, I agree. And to the way we were talking earlier about, family connections and community. I think that's also a massive change in the modern world. And I think it matters. All of this matters.
It really does matter. This podcast, as you all know, is called Feel Better, Live More. I genuinely believe, from talking to people, from what I've seen in my practice for nearly 20 years, is that when people feel better in themselves, they get more out of their life. And I think your research and your book, very clearly demonstrates that. So I wonder if you could leave my listeners with a few tips, some actionable tips, hopefully inspire them, hopefully at the end of a conversation that I think they're going to have found fascinating, to go and make some of these changes into their lives. So what are some of your top tips that you think are practical for most people?
Okay. I think the first one would be to try and dim your evenings and brighten your days. That doesn't, as I said, it doesn't mean that you have to completely abolish artificial light at night. But you can do simple things like turn off the overhead ceiling lights, switch to kind of dimmer table lamps, those kind of things. Make sure that if you're using screens, that you try and put them on night mode, but also double check that the screen is dimmer at night. And it should look a bit redder, ideally. But bear in mind that won't completely reduce all the like blue spectrum light that you're exposed to. So you do also need to try and
put it off.
Definitely, like in the immediate run up to bed. And again, this is a kind of a holistic approach as well. If you're kind of like checking work emails just before bed, I certainly find this. I then can't go to sleep because I'm thinking about work. So try and avoid bright and particularly blue spectrum light, and often the light doesn't look blue, it kind of looks whitey, like bright white. So just try and kind of go for that kind of more orangey, softer, warm lighting and keep it dim and kind of cozy, kind of romantic lighting is what you should be aspiring to in the evenings. And in the daytime, just do, I realize that I'm really lucky. I'm a freelance journalist. I can kind of choose my work hours. I can go for walks around the block when I feel like it, apart from the whole deadline thing. But I think there are little things you can do to just boost your light exposure, like walk to work, cycle to work, go for a walk around the block. It doesn't have to take huge amount of time. But you're also getting some exercise. You're also getting up from your desk. You're often like just breaking, just having a little bit of time to reflect on what you've been doing. If it's a nice day, not obviously if it's raining, it's more challenging, but, eat your lunch in the park. Invite your friends or your colleagues to, take a walk around the block and discuss that issue that you're kind of working on together while walking. So you're getting exercise and light. And I think the other main message is about regularity. It is hard, and I struggle with this as well, but where possible, try and keep a more regular schedule. So try and go to bed at more or less the same time every night. Obviously, sometimes that's not going to happen, but just try to do it as much as possible and get up at the same time each morning. And try to avoid eating at night and drinking alcohol. And that's challenging as well. But I think, when you start doing it, you'll realize you feel better when you live like that. Yeah,
Linda, some brilliant tips there. A lot of quite simple tips there, which I find fascinating that I can talk to a variety of different experts on a variety of different topics, and often some of the tips are quite similar. And I find that fascinating because the science can be incredibly complex, but actually some of the practical take-homes are very straightforward. And I really hope that that's inspiring and empowering for people. Yeah. Linda, thanks for making the journey up here today. Thanks for your time. Thanks for coming. And maybe we'll continue this at some point in the future.
I would love to. Thank you for having me.
No worries.